Excellent. Nothing like a few technical issues on a Friday afternoon before a long weekend. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Chris Pettit. I'm the Director of the City Futures Research Centre. I'm very pleased today to be welcoming you all to this City Futures seminar series. We have a number of us in the building, so to speak, City Analytics Lab, and many of you online. So we have this event running in a hybrid format. So firstly, I would like to pay my respects and acknowledge that we are attending this workshop, participating in this workshop on the magnificent coastal land of the Bidjigal people of the Aurora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all and to introduce Professor Hal Paulson, who probably doesn't need any introduction to anyone. I know no one in the room and probably many of you online. Hal is an eminent scholar in housing policy. He is the managing editor for the International Journal for Housing Studies. He is undertaking a number of pieces of work that are being picked up in the media, informing the debate on housing, affordability, social housing, and the many important dimensions of housing. And it's obviously very topical at the moment. It's always topical in Sydney and in Australia as we try and look at housing issues, but I guess even this week with the Reserve Bank raising its interest rates, that pressure that we're feeling from housing stress is exacerbated even more. So the piece of work that Hal will be presenting today is from an ARC linkage project, which is being led by Professor Alan Morris from UTS. So welcome, Alan. I think I've seen you online, and colleagues at University of Queensland. So I'll hand over to Hal to go through the presentations, and there'll be questions at the end. And anyone who's online, please use your chat feature to put those questions into the chat, and we can address those at the end of the presentation. Thank you, Hal.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to be talking about a research project that is ongoing, but we published the research team's actually published a number of outputs from it over the last few months, and the most recent, or one of the most recent, I guess, Alan has published a paper even in the last few days. But this slot this afternoon is about a report that came out just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to sort of take you through the report to give you a sense, just to give people a sense of the breadth of it to begin with, and then I'll go into a bit more depth on certain aspects of it. So this is a working paper that I'm talking about, and one of it's authored by myself and by my colleague David Lilly, who's online. So thanks very much to David for doing a lot of hard yards on collating a lot of data that went into this. It's part of this project, this bigger project that Chris Pettit has just mentioned, which goes under the name of Waithood. It's led by Alan, and there's a web address on this slide, which is a place where you can go to find out everything about this project. The main aim of the project overall is to understand the impact on the people who are directly affected by the intensifying shortage of social housing in Australia, which has been ongoing for 20 or 30 years. But from the perspective of people who are actually registered on the social housing waiting list, understanding a bit more about their situation and how they cope with that being in that position of, in some cases, waiting for potentially many years for a tenancy offer. But there's a subsidiary aim to the project, which is probably more directly relevant to this presentation this afternoon, which is to understand how state and territory governments really sort of trade off or weigh up, reconcile the pressures that they are facing to manage an increasingly scarce resource in a way that, as much as possible, sort of balances efficiency and equity. So this is just to give you a sense of the breadth of the report as a whole. And so we're recognising that the social housing waiting list, is the way it's seen by state and territory governments, certainly, is that it's part of a wider range of housing assistance services. And we're trying to set it within that context in this report and in this presentation. So the report as a whole, and the list of chapters that you can see on the screen, this is to sort of give you a sense of the sort of comprehensiveness of it, I suppose. So we're drawing here on. So really, it begins with a kind of problem statement, or it sets out in chapter 2 a kind of paradox, really, how it is that the number of people who are registered for social housing hasn't really been changing in the way that a lot of us would expect over 10 or 15 years. And why would that be? And then we revisit that at the end of the report and at the end of the presentation. And in between those two, we work through a sequence of the way that the people who are looking for help with housing, when they go to a state government or territory government to ask for some form of help with housing, there are a series of steps which they may go through, and it's a number of steps before they potentially become eligible for a social housing tenancy offer. So where does this all come from? It's a desktop exercise, mostly. There's a little bit of reference to some qualitative interviews that the team has done as part of the wider research project with state and territory governments, staff, senior managers and more frontline members of staff, and also advocacy agencies, people who've got a view of the process from the consumer end. So there's a little bit of that in it, but the vast bulk of the evidence that's in this report is a desktop exercise. It's coming from the nationally published, mostly statistical data, which is mostly found in the report on government services published by the Productivity Commission every year, the so-called ROGS report, and the AIHW, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's collection of housing statistics that they also source through the state and territory governments and publish annually in the collection called Housing Assistance in Australia. So we're trying to, integrate those, bring those sources together in some sort of coherent way. That's basically the purpose or a big purpose of the report. There is a little bit more beyond that. We have what the wider project has a bit of a case study focus on 3 particular states. So New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania are where we've done our primary field work, are where we've done a big number of interviews with waiting list applicants and also with stakeholders involved in providing the service or for tenants or for applicants. So there's a little bit more data, a little bit more depth in the report about New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania. But as you'll see, the data that you can get from those kinds of sources is very rarely collected or published on a consistent basis. So let's go into the sort of problem statement or the introduction really to the one of the curiosities, I guess we could say, or paradoxes about waiting list. The headline statistic on waiting lists, which the headline statistic is what is the total number at a point in time at the end of each financial year. That's the number that the ROGS report publishes each year, and it gets a certain amount of media attention. That's a starting point for this. So what this graph is doing is it's showing that number on the red bar. That's the latest number that you would extract from that process. Just over 160,000 registrations, which means households, not people. It probably means well over 200,000 people, might be 250,000 even. We don't actually know because it's not. That's one of the first complaints I'm going to make about missing data. It's often used in the media. It's often cited in advocacy for expanded government help with housing, on the basis that it's a very conceptually simple measure. It's a very we can all understand what that means, or at least we think we do. It seems straightforward, so it's very attractive from that point of view. But you'll see from this graph that other ways of measuring or estimating the shortfall of social housing stock in the country the ones I've given, and I think probably anybody could cite, give you a larger number than that. And there are three particular examples I've given there, and we can come back to this if people want to discuss this at the end. But the key point is the waiting list number is relatively small compared to the others. The other crucial thing, of course, about the validity of this kind of number is that it is highly susceptible to the way that the system is managed, administrative practices on the part of state and territory governments to keep these numbers updated or keep these data. It's kind of drawn out of data sets, really, which is that's the underlying source of people who've been they've approached their state or territory government, and they've been assessed and considered eligible. That's the process. So, and of course, it's also dependent on whether people bother to express their need or demand for housing in that way, which is something which possibly is changing over time. So here's the paradox. Here's the graph which really, I think, sets up a huge question. What we're doing here is we're looking at trends over time that start in about 15 years ago. And we're just indexing them as though each of these series begins at 100. And the red line is the numbers on the waiting list. This is the snapshot number at the end of each financial year, published in the ROGS. Well, it doesn't actually increase. Well, it goes up and down a bit over the time. It's risen by 16% in the last 3 years or so. But over 15 years, it's more or less where it started. And when you bear in mind the other trends on this graph, these are simple numbers. They're not not indexed to population, but population itself is shown there in green. That's somewhat higher than the increase in the waiting list. Then we've got the brown line, which is homelessness numbers in the census. We await the 2021 number there, so it's a bit out of date. The numbers in rental stress have been increasing much quicker than any of the others. So it raises a question: how valid is this statistic to tell us anything that's meaningful about the unmet need for social housing or the need for additional provision? I mean, it looks to me as though it's becoming less valid. I think that would be the most obvious deduction from this. And why would that be? Well, it could be that it's to do with changing behaviour on the part of people who are experiencing housing need. It may be that people are increasingly realising that there's no point, that a social housing tenancy might be desirable, but there's so little chance of getting one. I've looked at the New South Wales government website, and in my area it says that for a 3-bedroom home you're going to wait 10 years or more. So why would I bother to go through the hassle of registering? So it may be that that's increasingly the case. It could even be the case that it's increasingly something that people don't really want. Yes, I've got a housing problem. I've got rental stress, or I've got something unsuitable about my existing home that means that ideally I would like something that suits me better, that's more affordable. But maybe social housing has become even more stigmatized in the last 10 years, so that people are shying away from making an application. So that's another would be another hypothesis. But I think managerial changes are also very likely to form part of the explanation, that the perhaps increasing efficiency or rigour or enthusiasm around deleting records that are considered to be no longer valid or no longer eligible. It could well be the case that those processes are deleting invalid records in a way that they perhaps historically weren't. Or it may be that there's just more people who are falling off the register every year because they're not taking the trouble to reconfirm their need, which I'll come back to. So The second slide, which I think raises some questions, is this one, which is showing the end of year point in time waiting list number in each separate jurisdiction in Australia and the Australia-wide number, proportionate to population. So what we see here is a really pretty big variation. Even if you exclude the Northern Territory, which has got some unusual factors to it, there is still a really huge variation in the pro rata to population size of the waiting list in each jurisdiction in Australia, particularly with at the right-hand end, the Queensland number looks particularly low. So I think, again, that hints at varied eligibility rules, or maybe varied rigorousness or efficiency of the management of records, so that there's a very generous interpretation of people who still want social housing at one end of the spectrum and a very strict one at the other. So we're going to come back to all of that, but let's just first recognise that this is part of a bigger picture of a range of what state and territory governments would call products, which are made available, which will potentially available to assist people with some form of housing need. And this is just, again, to show with the scale of the number of people who are assisted every year by getting a social housing tenancy is relatively small compared to some of these other forms of assistance. Admittedly, most of those other forms of assistance are of a lesser nature. That's, very fair point to make. The two green ones are the services that are provided by specialist homelessness agencies. Then the two blue ones are forms of, or the three blue ones are forms of private rental assistance that are made available by state and territory governments. And the numbers here are not totally comparable because the green ones are on the basis of people and the others are on the basis of households. But, I think it's still got some validity to it. And if we look at what this means in the case of New South Wales, just to for a sort of one particular case study, the social housing allocation part of that, that sort of range of that menu of assistance is the part in the two quite small sectors of this pie at the top right. The blue is people who are housed every year who are priority cases, and the orange is the others housed off the waiting list who were not given a high priority. But there's much larger proportions of the pie, which are people given private rental assistance or temporary accommodation for that matter. This graph doesn't even include all of the assistance that's provided by specialist homelessness services. This is purely what comes through government directly. So who's eligible for social housing, and how consistent are the rules around that across the country? Well, I think it's pretty standard that you are required to be an Australian citizen or permanent resident. Beyond that, though, the critical thing is what's your income and in which state are you applying, because the income levels that are required, as you'll see in a minute, actually vary quite a lot. Victoria is a particularly unusual state because it has two income limits. It has one income limit which is relatively high, which means if you're below that level of income, you can go on the register. And then it has a substantially lower income limit, and unless your income is below that, you can't get priority status. I think that's how it works. In most other states, there's simply an income limit which determines are you eligible to even get your name on the register. And it's perhaps worth mentioning that this isn't, while social housing systems in many other countries have administratively governed waiting lists of this kind, they don't all have this sort of income limit even to be eligible to have your name on the list. So I think we can see, I think, some consistency between these rather varied income limits, which I'll show you in a moment, and the size of the register. So, and that at least is slightly reassuring in terms of logic. It does seem logical that South Australia, which has a significantly higher income limit, also has a larger waiting list in relation to population than Queensland, which has a much lower income limit, and as we saw in the previous slide, a much lower proportion to a pro rata number on the waiting list. So here's the graph which sets out the detail, and I won't go into it in detail, but you get some sense of the level of variation. The blue bars are the income limits for single adults, single person household, and the orange for two-person households. And so the purpose of the green line is that's the level which for a full-time worker on the minimum wage would be earning in a week. And in 5 jurisdictions, that means you're ineligible for social housing. You're only eligible if you're just a part-time worker or you're a social security recipient. Not saying this is good, bad, right or wrong. It's a very crucial component of the rationing mechanism. So what's the process of applying for social housing? I mean, the first part is you probably are first given or assessed for these wider range of housing assistance products that I mentioned a minute ago. But assuming that you're judged to be needing something more than that and eligible for something more than that, then you'll be potentially having your name on the social housing register. In most jurisdictions, there is nowadays just one social housing register, and the various different sorts of social housing, public housing, community housing, Indigenous housing, those landlords are obliged, more or less strictly, I think, possibly in different jurisdictions, to take their to abide by that ranking of applicants in choosing the person most qualified for a vacancy that is available to let. And one of the ways in which the data, the published data, are extremely confusing is the fact that the ROGS collection hasn't recognised or realised that the old world of separate waiting lists for Indigenous community and public housing no longer exists in most states, at least, and that's one of the real annoying aspects of the way that these statistics are published. You don't know whether you can add these together or how states are interpreting them. We'll come back to that at the end. So usually people are being expected to register online. Sometimes there is still a paper form possibility, but there's a lot of emphasis on trying to get people to register online. Come into the office, here's a computer terminal, sit down, we'll give you some help if you need it. Otherwise, if you've got someone advocating on your behalf, they'll help you. So that isn't that isn't universal, but I think it would be common. Sometimes you have the opportunity to, how much choice do you have? Well, you may have a choice about what sort of social housing you want. If you might, know the difference between public housing and community housing and think you want one, not the other, perhaps. How much people do that, we don't really know. You certainly will be expected to make some preference about where you want to live or where you need to live, if it's social or job reasons, and that may or may not be very tightly defined. It may be that the sort of choice that you have really means that you're opting for an area which is perhaps quite a big area, and it includes some places where yes you would like to live and you think it's suitable, and others where it's far from, it's remote from your perspective. Increasingly, we think that the documentation that people are expected to provide as evidence that they might deserve or qualify for extra priority is really becoming onerous. And that, I think, is very clearly coming through from the stakeholder interviews in the wider project. And I think it seems clear that increasingly if you're applying for social housing and you're doing so with the assistance of some form of support organisation, advocacy organisation, that's really going to, that could make a big difference to your chances of getting priority status, because the help that you might need on documentation is the kind of thing that a lot of people who most need social housing are least able to do without that kind of help. So yeah, having a support worker is probably something really important nowadays, maybe more so than it used to be. So who actually applies for social housing? What's the profile of people who are on the social housing waiting list? Well, across Australia, the answer is we don't know, because the published statistics really don't give any sense of what the cohort of households is. So we've been able to draw from a couple of, or a little bit from all three case study states that we're looking at in the project to say a little bit more about that, as shown in the graph. I say only a little bit because, as I mentioned before, even if this data is published by individual states, there's no guidance about typologies or classifications or definitions, at least not that's abided by. So it's quite hard to make comparisons, but at least for two of our states, we think we can make some comparisons here. So for New South Wales and Queensland, what we can see is that around about half of the applications on the register at any one time are people who are either single adult households or they need a one-bedroom unit. Actually, I was quite surprised at this. I thought that the dominance of single person applicants would be higher. So maybe other people, it doesn't come as such a surprise, but I thought that was interesting. Of course, this matters a lot because it gives us an indication of it's all very well if we were able to say, oh, we need X number of 100,000 additional social housing properties. That's only semi-useful if you don't know what size of properties you need. So this kind of information is important from a sort of policy planning point of view. There's even less data on time series here, but we can just say from the New South Wales data that over the last, more or less the last decade, it does appear that there's been an increasing representation of older people, an increasing representation of Indigenous applicants. Those cohorts form a somewhat larger proportion of the total waiting list in New South Wales now than they did in 2012. So let's go on to managing the register and also how long you wait if you last the distance. So just to sort of go back, circle back again to this sort of trend over time data, and to ask the question, does it mean anything? I think this graph again suggests that it doesn't, or at least it gives you some doubts about the value of this as a sort of indicator of change in a time series. Because what this data is showing is for individual states, or for the largest jurisdictions in Australia, how those numbers have changed, the snapshot total at the end of the year over the last 15 years or so. And there's some very exotic patterns that are shown there, which I very much doubt reflect genuine changes in underlying need from one year to the next. So I think it strongly hints at administrative inconsistency, not just that this state does it different from this state, it's this state did it differently this year than it did 2 or 5 years ago. So again, another reason for caution with these numbers. One of the factors which I think is potentially something that we would like to know more about is not just the numbers, point in time numbers at the end of each year, which I think is highly susceptible to the way that waiting lists are managed. I think what would perhaps be a more meaningful number that ought to be less erratic in that sense is new waiting list applications. the flow of people coming to the state or territory government during a period, let's say a year, and saying, I've got a housing problem, what can you do to help me with that? Am I eligible for social housing? Unfortunately, the published data doesn't collect exactly that. It does collect something. It does collect a statistic which goes under the name of new greatest need applicant. And this is descended. This has been in the data for a long time, at least 15 years. And I would suggest it's well past its sell-by date. What it's trying to do, the intention there, is that greatest need applicant, inverted commas, is defined by the AIHW. It could mean this, or this. And essentially it's saying a greatest need applicant is someone who's already homeless or is at risk of homelessness. But the way that it's interpreted in different states is, all over the place, I would say, which is, I think completely devalues the point of even printing it, which is a shame because it potentially could be useful. And what we can see in the graph is the new greatest need applicants per 1,000 households. Again, varying really enormously between, even if you take the Northern Territory out of it, even between this part, even the numbers in from Tasmania, which has got 13, down to New South Wales, which has got 2. So it doesn't seem likely that those would be genuinely comparable. And in this graph, this is a graph which kind of shows a similar thing, just expressing it in a slightly different way. So what we're led to believe from this is that in Queensland, almost everyone, this is 100% of those on the waiting list at the end of this particular June 2021. According to the published statistics, almost 100% of those people are not only new applicants this year, but new greatest need applicants this year. So there was no one on the register before this year? No, I don't think it doesn't tie up with other stats, but this is what's published. It's patently meaningless. So, I think this is, and it isn't only Queensland that's interpreting this in a weird way. And, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got New South Wales and Western Australia, which have got a remarkably small proportion of greatest need applicants as a proportion of all. And I would suggest that's almost certainly because they are interpreting greatest need in relation to their own internal rules, which determine who gets priority for an allocation, which is something much narrower than greatest need. It's something that is particularly in these two states. So this is a metric which could be useful but isn't. And to go into this in a little bit more depth, and this is, I think, where we have really added value in this report in a way which the rest of it is okay. Most of it is published data that one can find on various websites. This particular graph is not. It's partly deduced from published data, but it also incorporates one key number, which from the New South Wales government kindly provided as part of the research, which helps to understand much better the dynamics of the social housing register. So what we've got here is we've got a couple of numbers which are published. The total number of waiting list applicants at the beginning of the year 2021, 49, nearly 50,000, and then a similar number, slightly lower number at the start of the following year. So in a year, the overall number just was slightly lower. But what took place within the year was a huge amount of flux. Firstly, we had this part of the sort of just over 60% probably of the list, people who were remaining on the register. The deduction is that they were on the register throughout that year and continued into the following year. Then we've got the light blue part of the bar, which is the people who got a tenancy. They came off the register because they were offered a tenancy in social housing. But then quite a significant number at the top in the yellow. This is just over 6,000 households who or registrations, to be absolutely, accurate about it, which fell off the register during that financial year for reasons unknown. For a range of reasons that we can kind of speculate the kinds of things that could have been involved and probably were involved, but we don't know the proportions. There will be a few people who died before the tenancy, they got offered a tenancy, for sure. Maybe just a few, but there will be some. There will be some who no longer needed social housing because they solved their problems in the private market. Maybe because household formation changed, single person with not much income, partnered with, a partner with a better income and housing situation. So yeah, there's certainly that as well. But there's also undoubtedly a significant part of that group who have fallen off the register because their record has been deleted. They either became ineligible for some reason, or they simply didn't reconfirm their desire to be on the register. So in this particular year, the proportion of, or the number of registrations that ended for reasons other than getting a tenancy was just over half the proportion or the number that got a tenancy. And I don't think there's any reason to think that would be very different in other states, but we don't actually know. So how long do people actually wait for social housing, for a tenancy, and how much does it vary? Well, before we get to the graph, just the bullet point one isn't shown in the graph, but it's in the AIHW statistics. Around about half of new public housing tenants are actually housed in under 6 months, which I think comes as a bit of a surprise, but that's what the published data shows at the national level. In certain states, it would be, and in certain parts of certain states, it will be a lot different to that. The AIHW statistics don't show anything below the national scale, so we don't actually know, but I think we can say with some certainty that's the case. But going on to looking at the graph itself, what we're doing here is we're comparing this rather weak indicator, greatest need applicant versus non-greatest need applicant. I mean, I'm not saying it's got no validity, it's got some, but it's weak because of its different interpretation in different states. But what it shows is, logically, people with higher, who are a greatest need, have got a greatest need label against them, are more likely to be housed in a shorter time. So what is it, 42% of the greatest need applicants are getting housed within 3 months across the country. Only a fifth of people who don't have that label. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got nearly a fifth of the non-greatest need applicants who are waiting at least 5 years. Many registrations lapse every year without getting a tenancy. So part of the reason why these figures might come as a bit of a surprise is that this large amount of churn on the waiting list that are shown in the previous slide is part of that is people who didn't last a distance. Whether it's because they're no longer still alive, or whether they are no longer an applicant because they couldn't be bothered with the hassle of confirming an application which they thought was a waste of time. A mix of those things. We also know, and some states, maybe all states, can't be quite sure, but certainly New South Wales tries to give quite detailed guidance to applicants, to the public, you could say, of how long you would expect to wait as a non-priority applicant. You're eligible, but you don't have priority in different parts of the state. And there's a table you can find on the New South Wales government website which highlights this, and it shows that in most parts of Sydney, a non-priority applicant needing a 3-bedroom home is going to wait more than 10 years. So the process of maintaining your registration is, I think, probably very important. And we don't know a lot about the detail of exactly how that happens, but it's understood that that routinely state and territory governments, the staff who are administering the social housing register, are sending a postcard or making some kind of contact. Maybe it's done by text sometimes nowadays, I'm not entirely sure, but seeking a confirmation that that person is still in this world, and they're still wanting social housing, and they may also have to say that they're still eligible. In Tasmania, I believe this happens every 6 months. In New South Wales, I think it's every year. How many reminders or different efforts there are to contact people who, you know, have moved house or lost their phone or whatever. We don't. All of these things are quite important. They're really down in the detail of administration, but they probably make quite a big difference to the statistics or to the way the service is run. So yeah, there's a lot more that one could find out ideally there if you had the access. So going towards the end of the presentation, let's just talk briefly about how social housing is actually allocated. What about who actually gets an offer of social housing if they can stay the distance? Well, I think the first thing to point out here, or first, I think important point to make that comes out of the statistics, is that when you look at this measure of, I think this is the number of tenancies that are granted each year, is, I think, the best indicator of the capacity of the social housing system that we have. It's not the way we usually look at it. It's usually, people much more often talk about stock numbers. Yes, that's important too. But if we look at the change over time over the last, over a period of decades, and the graph here is looking at 30 years, what we can see is that if you measure the changing capacity of the social housing sector in terms of tenancies allocated every year, that shows a much steeper reduction, in fact, than stock. In fact, stock in numerical terms is slightly higher than it was in 1991, not by much, by far less than population, which is what this is another point that this is trying to make. So on the basis of lettings, we are actually looking at a sector that has 42% less capacity than it had in 1991, when the population is nearly half as big again. Yeah, and there are two reasons why this is the case. One reason is that in 1991, there was still an annual national routine public housing construction development investment program. So every year there was a certain number, some thousands, usually around 8,000 or 10,000 new tenancies available as a result of the brand new property being let for the first time. In the last 10 years or so, we've hardly had any, or it's been a very, very small number of tenancies coming through that route. And the other route, what's nowadays overwhelmingly the biggest one, is existing homes that are being relet when the previous tenant has passed away or moved into institutional accommodation, or is moved out for some other reason, moved to into the private market. That is also a much lower, a much less frequent thing nowadays than it was 20, 30 years ago, mostly because the ability to jump from the social housing into the private market now is so much less than it used to be historically. Historically, a lot of people would be giving up tenancies every year even to go to the bottom end of home ownership. Nowadays, the gap is so huge that is something that is very, is very rare. So the turnover in the stock is very low nowadays. So what's the actual process that determines who gets an offer, that leads to the sort of aggregate outcomes that, we can look at in the statistics? So as I mentioned before, if you're eligible for social housing because you've got, citizenship qualifications or residency, and you also your income is below the given level, and there's one or two other minor eligibility issues that are covered in our report as well. If you're eligible, then you're assessed for your degree of need. You may be eligible, but do you have any additional need? And so the default position is you're eligible, but you don't have it. You know, you're simply entitled potentially to get an offer at some time in the future, but you've got no special high ranking because you need it more than other people. So as an example, New South Wales has got two basic categories. It's not quite as simple as this in practice, but it's at a, generally speaking, we could say there's priority and there's general. And to get into the priority category, you have to have quite severe or urgent needs, or severe and/or urgent needs, and that is only about 10% of all of the registrations in New South Wales at any one time. So we have around 50,000 on the register at any one time. Only about 5,000 of those are priority cases. But if you are a priority case, your chances of being housed and being housed relatively quickly are massively higher than if you're a general list applicant. You've also got the complication in practice of the fact that some people are being considered for a tenancy who are already social housing tenants, and they need to move within the tenure, not to enter it. Of course, they create a vacancy behind them if they get housed. But from the point of view of choosing somebody who needs, who's got the best qualification for a tenancy, some of those people may be existing tenants. People who urgently need to move because they where they're living is unsuitable. They've become ill or disabled in such a way that the house they've got was fine before, but it doesn't work anymore. Or their home's going to be redeveloped, and so they need to be helped to move to enable that to happen. Or perhaps because they've become over time a single person or a couple household in a 4-bedroom property, and that's a huge waste of resources. But so both priority and non-priority cohorts are both ranked internally within each of those groups by waiting time. I think that's the sort of standard way of doing this. So what are the aggregate outcomes of this? So what this is showing you is that what the graph is showing us is that in New South Wales, if we look at the proportion of all lettings which are divided between this priority and the general group, don't forget the priority group is only 1/10 of the number, but the priority group is now receiving 60% of all lettings in the state, and that's substantially increased over a relatively short time, over only 6 years or so, from only around 40%. So I think this is the process, the way it works in New South Wales, and I suspect it's not very different in another state, is that for any vacancy that becomes available, the highest ranked applicant for that vacancy will always be the first thing that the allocator looks for, that the system generates, is the priority applicants whose needs match with that property. They need a property of that size in that location, maybe one or two other factors that affect that. So you will, in most cases, you will get a priority, a short list of potential tenants who are priority applicants ranked by waiting time. As we can see in this graph, that isn't always the case, because sometimes general applicants do get a tenancy. Proportionate to their numbers on the waiting list, it's very unusual, but it does happen, and it accounts for nowadays about 40% of all lettings in New South Wales. And when does that happen? Well, it happens when there is no priority applicant who is suitable for that particular vacancy, because the property is in a part of the country where demand is relatively low, because it's a property that's of an unusual type. It might be a studio apartment in a a less than sort of top ranking or the most desirable area. So essentially what this means is that lettings to non-priority applicants, at least the way it works in New South Wales, is that this is basically a residual. It's not determined by quota or anything like that. It's simply a result of the way the system works, and it's the number that are available after all priority applicants have been taken care of who are suitable for that tenancy. Sorry, that's a bit laborious to explain that, but some people may be interested in that level of detail. So one of the implications of what's happening here is that the expected waiting time for people who are not priority applicants, as a result of this squeezing of the proportion of all tenancies that they're getting, is going to be, it's going to be bad news for you if you're in that category. So, getting very quickly through to the conclusions. I think, just to revisit what I call the paradox that we talked about at the beginning, I think this inconsistency between the trend of waiting list numbers over a long time and the other measures of housing need that we think at least are valid. I think that reflects both the scale of churn, the turnover of people who are going onto the waiting list and then falling off it without getting a tenancy through it, and also probably increasingly rigorous management of the list over time, and maybe also tighter eligibility rules that mean not so many people are even allowed to get their name on it. And an example of that is that in a couple of states, the income level, the income maximum that you're allowed to have before you could, in order to get registered, has stayed the same for, or nearly the same for, a decade or more. So effectively, it's tightening the criteria. Okay, just two more slides, which are just going to the data side of this, because I think in some ways the biggest conclusion of this whole exercise is really we've got a very, very imperfect basis for policy making in this area. And we would hope that we've got a new federal government that may be a bit more interested in it than the last one. So maybe there is a little bit more of a receptiveness to this message than there has been for the last 10 years or so. The published data are very imperfect in several ways. The metrics and the definitions need looking at in a lot of cases. The way that they're interpreted by state and territory governments is patently inconsistent. And the presentation, no disrespect to our colleagues at the Productivity Commission and the AIHW, but I don't think they're easy to use. I think a lot of people who are interested in this topic don't find it easy to, discover the sorts of numbers which really ought to be fairly easy, I think, to access and understand. And I think this compounds this isn't the only area of problematic, the only problematic issue in the area of social housing data. I mean, I think that there are very fundamental problems with stock, new construction and demolitions data, which are really basic things that are really within the province more of the ABS than the AIHW. And I think those things ought to be attended to at the same time. And maybe through the renegotiation of the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement that's going on at the moment, I mean, that possibly is a venue or a platform to enable that. So here are 5 potential, this is the final slide, just 5 ideas for ways that we could high priority, in my opinion, things that need to be fixed. I mentioned before this lack of mutual exclusivity around the simple numbers of the waiting list numbers at the end of the year in the ROGs is stupid and needs to be clarified. We've got real problems around this new greatest need applicant statistic. It's got so little value, it's not worth even publishing it anymore. What we need, though, is something much better to replace it, and I'm making a suggestion there which I won't go through. The profile of waiting list applicants is something that I think a lot of people are interested in, and it's important for policy making too, for reasons of determining, how we should be targeting what scarce resources we might have towards new construction in some sort of rational way. We need to try to understand a bit better the duration of wait for new tenancies by people who are going through the register. And I think that could be pretty easily done because the AIHW certainly collects that data from every state and territory, but chooses only to publish the national numbers at the moment. And I think the turnover of applications is another important statistic. You know, what is the makeup of this group of applications, this group of applicants and registrations that are falling off the register every year? How is the, what's the mix of that? I think that would be meaningful as well. And here are a few references that I've referred to in the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hal. Very comprehensive presentation. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to ask any questions. For those who are here face to face, it's an opportunity also for a catch up with Hal for a drink or two afterwards for further questions. But I do want to highlight, I think you shed some really important light on, I guess, the data, the indicators and the metrics that are available and the need to have that data and evidence to have better policy setting and being able to drill in more systematically, consistently across the jurisdictions.
And you would be a very receptive person to the questions about data.
So I might hand it over to the audience for any questions. I might start online. There's a number of questions online.
Do you want me to read them out?
That would be great, Lee.
Yeah. So Stacey commented back on slide 22, kind of the key question about the New South Wales data. She said the New South Wales priority applicants are housed faster compared to the general waiting list, so that may account for the difference in New South Wales data.
Yeah, I mean, according to our analysis of the numbers, it's somewhere between 7 times and 14 times as fast or faster to be a priority applicant than it is a non-priority applicant from the limited data that we've got. So yeah, I mean, it makes an absolutely enormous difference in this state at any rate.
And then John commented, he's never sure if people currently in severe overcrowding, per ABS 2016 statistics, who represent 44,000 of the total homelessness stats, are ever contemplated. New South Wales urgently needs a big house program to address the 10-year plus wait for this cohort.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't know how much sort of overlap or duplication there is in these numbers. It would be, I would think that a lot of people or probably everyone in those circumstances would qualify, at least in terms, they would probably have some needs priority. Then whether they have citizenship and income eligibility is not so sure for all of them, but yeah, fair point.
And then Adam commented that he imagines that a large cohort of those falling off the waiting list are rough sleepers, given that they don't have an address and can't respond to postcards to update their details.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think we would be quite concerned about that. It may be that, and it may be that there are state and territory colleagues online now who can tell us that it's all taken care of. We make, a big effort to go out and look for people if they don't reply, or try and contact people multiple ways, not just through a letter that, relies on the address being the same, but texts or, well, I guess by email even. But yeah, we don't really know. But the point that is being made there is that it is important. Absolutely, it is important, and how much effort there is that's made there. It's an administrative decision.
And then Stacey commented that priority need clients also have a higher turnover relative to in regards to losing their tenancies.
Yeah, that's right. We do know that the New South Wales, at least in New South Wales, if you're a priority applicant, you can be supported financially through. There is a fund that's available to provide financial support for the period that if you're actually homeless or, you know, you've got no other accommodation, you've got no other option, that there is a top-up available that people can access that bridges the gap between the sort of maximum that they can pay affordably and what it would cost them to, you know, to get some temporary accommodation for, you know, often only for, you know, in most parts of, well, in some parts of New South Wales anyway, it might only be 2 or 3 months that's required. So yeah, we believe that's around 1,300 of the priority cases at any one time in New South Wales out of 5,000. So around about a third are getting that kind of help. You know, how much help they're getting there, we don't actually know, but some financial help to enable them to, you know, at least stay off the street for as long as it takes to offer them a tenancy that we hope is suitable for them.
And that's the last comment online. So
Anyone in the room?
I have a question, a geography related question. Any idea whether the availability or lack of availability of social housing stock is driving mobility within cities or interstate? Perhaps ease of getting access to social housing in certain states, is it pushing people out of certain states?
I doubt if it's having very much impact at that scale. I mean, we're talking about a cohort of the population who are probably the least mobile, many of whom are the least mobile people in the whole population, or you know, relatively immobile, we could say at any rate. Certainly, government is the kind of detailed information about the waiting times in different parts of New South Wales that's published by the New South Wales government. Certainly, that is intended to influence applicants, firstly about whether to apply or not, or if you are going to apply, to give you some sort of indication of maybe you should tailor your choice of areas that you would be willing to accept, recognizing that the place that you wanted to go, you are going to wait 10 years, but down the road there, it's actually less than 5, or, you know, it still might be a lot. But so there's an attempt to get people to factor this into their decision making, but we don't. You'd need a really in-depth study to, you know, to validate that.
I'm conscious we've gone 5 minutes over, so I might hold the questions there. Any further questions, grab Hal after the seminar. If you're in the audience here face to face, any more questions online, please contact Hal. But please all join me in thanking Hal for his presentation this afternoon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Hal. And in 2 weeks' time, please join us back. We have a couple of our staff, high degree research students that will be presenting on their research. Philip Grouse is one of those who's looking at the role of urban design for informing better city planning with a case study around Western Parkland City. So I hope everyone has a fantastic long weekend. And